Edmund Husserl spent nearly 5 decades trying to answer a single question. How does consciousness make contact with anything at all? That question sounds simple, but every attempt to answer it runs into a wall. If you say the mind just mirrors the world, you cannot explain error, illusion, or mathematics. If you say the mind constructs reality, you cannot explain why the world resists us. Husserl refused to accept either answer, and what he built instead became phenomenology. Phenomenology is not a set of doctrines about what exists or what is true. It is a disciplined method for examining experience from the inside on its own terms. Husserl believed this method could resolve problems that had paralyzed Western philosophy for centuries. Whether he succeeded remains genuinely contested, and we will confront that question honestly. But to evaluate his project, you first have to understand it from the ground up. That is what we are here to do. His system is not a loose collection of insights. It is an architecture where each level depends on the one beneath it. Miss a foundational move, and everything above it becomes unintelligible. So we will build it in the order Husserl himself was forced to build it. Each part addresses a problem that the previous part left open. By the end, you will be able to think inside this system and see exactly where it holds and where it cracks. We begin where Husserl began, with a catastrophic failure. Part 1. The problem that started. Everything. Husserl did not start out as a philosopher. He was a mathematician, trained in Vienna and Berlin under some of the finest mathematicians in Europe. His early obsession was a specific puzzle about the foundations of arithmetic. When you count 3 oranges on a table, what exactly are you doing? You see individual oranges, you group them, and you arrive at the number 3. But the number 3 is not an orange, and it is not a group of oranges. It is something your mind seems to produce in the act of grouping and counting. So Husserl's first serious philosophical project tried to ground arithmetic in psychology. The idea was that numbers emerge from specific mental operations, collecting, distinguishing, abstracting. If we could describe those operations precisely, we would understand what numbers really are. This approach has a name, psychologism, and it is far more intuitive than it might sound at first. Think about what happens when a child learns to count. She lines up wooden blocks, points to each one, and recites a sequence of words. The concept of 4 seems to crystallize out of that physical embodied activity. Psychologism takes this observation seriously and generalizes it to all of logic and mathematics. Logical laws, on this view, are descriptions of how the human mind actually operates. The law of non-contradiction, the rules of valid inference, the truths of arithmetic. All of these would be, at bottom, facts about the structure of human thinking. This was not a fringe position in the late 19th century. Prominent thinkers, including John Stuart Mill, had defended versions of it. It seemed like a way to make logic scientifically respectable by tying it to empirical psychology. Then the logician Gottlob Frege published a review of Husserl's first book that cut to the bone. Frege's objection was not a quibble about details, but an attack on the entire foundation. If logical truths are descriptions of how human minds happen to work, then they are contingent. They could have been otherwise if human brains had evolved differently. 2 + 2 = 4 would be true for us, but perhaps not for some alien species with different neural wiring. The law of non-contradiction would be a psychological regularity, not an absolute law. And psychological regularities admit exceptions, just as most humans prefer sweet over bitter, but some do not. This means logic itself would become a branch of natural science, subject to revision by future experiments. Feel the weight of that consequence. A chemist in a lab performs an experiment and gets an unexpected result. She checks her reasoning, looking for an error in her chain of inferences. But if logic is just psychology, then the laws she uses to check her reasoning are themselves empirical claims. They carry no more authority than the experimental result she is trying to verify. She would need some further standard to check whether her logical checking was itself valid. That further standard would also be a psychological claim, requiring yet another check. The ground falls away entirely, and no piece of reasoning can ever be fully trusted. Husserl was shaken by this, not because Frege was being clever, but because Frege was right. The problem was not a fixable mistake in Husserl's particular argument about arithmetic. It was a structural flaw in the entire project of reducing logic to mental events. If you make truth depend on the thinker, you destroy the very thing that makes truth truth. A proposition like, the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees does not fluctuate with brain chemistry. It holds whether anyone is thinking it or not, and whether human beings exist or not. So Husserl abandoned psychologism, and this abandonment was not a minor course correction. It was the intellectual earthquake that created phenomenology. Because now he faced a devastating new question that psychologism had conveniently avoided. If logical and mathematical truths are not produced by mental activity, they must exist independently of any mind. But they are not physical objects either. You cannot trip over the number 7 or put the law of non-contradiction under a microscope. These truths seem to inhabit some domain that is neither mental nor physical, and yet human minds access them constantly in every act of reasoning, every inference, every proof. How? That is the question. Not what are logical truths, but how does a conscious being make contact with something that transcends its own mental processes? This question has a scope far beyond logic. When you perceive a tree, the tree is not inside your skull. When you remember your childhood home, the home is not literally present. When you understand the meaning of a sentence, that meaning is not a physical object you can weigh. In every one of these cases, consciousness somehow reaches beyond itself towards something other. Husserl realized that answering this question required understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Not consciousness as studied by experimental psychology, measuring reaction times and stimulus responses. Not consciousness as theorized by philosophers who had already decided it must be a substance or a brain process, but consciousness examined directly in the very act of its reaching, its intending, its grasping. That examination would become phenomenology, But before the method could be built, Husserl needed to understand the reaching itself. Part 2. Consciousness is always consciousness. Of. The key to Husserl's entire project came from his teacher, the philosopher and psychologist Franz Brentano. Brentano had revived a concept from medieval philosophy and placed it at the centre of his psychology. The concept is intentionality, and it names something you already know but have likely never isolated. Every mental state is directed at something beyond itself. Fear is always fear of something, whether a spider, a diagnosis, or an undefined future. Desire is always desire for something, a meal, a promotion, a person. Perception is always perception of something, a red wall, a distant siren, the smell of rain. There is no such thing as pure, undirected consciousness, a mind that is simply on, without being on to anything. This might seem so obvious that it hardly needs stating, but compare consciousness with something genuinely non-intentional, like a rock or a thermostat. A rock sitting in a field does not refer to anything, point to anything, or mean anything. A thermostat responds to temperature, but it does not experience the heat or direct its awareness toward it. Consciousness, by contrast, always has this peculiar structure of being about, of, or toward. Brentano argued that this directedness is what distinguishes the mental from the physical, full stop. Every mental phenomenon exhibits intentionality, and no physical phenomenon does. That was Brentano's thesis, and it drew a sharp line between the domain of mind and the domain of matter. Husserl took this idea and pushed it somewhere Brentano never went. The critical move involved an observation that sounds simple, but has enormous consequences. You can be intentionally directed at things that do not exist. A child fears the monster under the bed, and that fear is perfectly real, vividly felt, structurally complete. But there is no monster, and there never was. The fear is not directed at a physical object in the room. It is directed at something consciousness itself has constituted. Or consider a mathematician working with imaginary numbers. She manipulates these entities with precision, derives valid proofs, and reaches conclusions that apply to engineering. But imaginary numbers do not exist anywhere in the physical world. Her consciousness is directed at something real enough to work with, but not real in the way a table is real. These cases reveal that intentionality cannot be a causal relationship between the mind and an external object. A causal relationship requires both terms to exist. A cause that does not exist causes nothing. But consciousness can be fully, genuinely directed at objects that have no existence outside the act itself. This means the directedness of consciousness is not a bridge between two separate things, a mind here and an object there. It is an internal structural feature of consciousness itself. Consciousness does not first exist as a blank container and then reach out toward the world. Its reaching is its existing. To be conscious at all is already to be directed at something. Now, see what this does to the way we normally think about minds and objects. The common sense picture treats the mind as an interior space and the world as an exterior space. Knowledge happens when something from the outside gets accurately copied into the inside. Perception is like a camera taking a picture. Memory is like a filing cabinet storing records. This picture feels natural because it maps onto our spatial intuitions about brains being inside skulls. But Husserl's analysis of intentionality dissolves this entire spatial metaphor. Consciousness is not an interior space that occasionally connects with an exterior world. It is, by its very nature, already out there, already directed, already engaged with its objects. There is a direct consequence of this that operates in your life every day without being noticed. When you walk into a room and see a chair, the common sense view says the chair causes an image in your brain. Then your brain processes the image and constructs a representation of the chair. The chair you experience is therefore a mental representation, not the real chair. You are locked inside your representations, and the real world is always one step removed. Husserl saw that this entire chain of reasoning rests on ignoring what intentionality reveals. Your perception of the chair is not a picture of the chair inside your mind. It is consciousness directed at the chair itself, grasping it under a specific aspect, from a specific angle. The chair, as you experience it, is the chair as it gives itself to you in that moment of perceptual contact. You are not trapped behind a wall of representations. You are already at the things themselves. This phrase, "to the things themselves," became the rallying cry of the phenomenological movement. But it does not mean naive realism, the view that we see the world exactly as it is without distortion. Husserl fully acknowledged that perception can be mistaken, that hallucinations occur, that expectations shape experience. The point is that even mistaken experience has the structure of intentional directedness. A hallucination of a snake is still consciousness directed at a snake, even though no snake is present. What phenomenology studies is not whether the object really exists, but how consciousness structures its directedness. The how of experience, the different ways consciousness can be aimed, shaped, and organized, is the subject matter. And that subject matter requires its own method, one that no existing science was equipped to provide. Here is why. Psychology, even in Husserl's time, studied the mind by observing behavior and measuring responses from the outside. But intentionality is not an observable behavior. It is the inner directedness of a conscious act. Neuroscience studies the brain, but brain activity as seen on a scan is not directed at anything. A pattern of neural firing does not point beyond itself the way a perception of a tree points at a tree. Philosophy had traditionally used introspection, but casual introspection is unreliable, unsystematic, and loaded with assumptions. Husserl needed a method that could examine the structures of intentional consciousness rigorously. That method would have to strip away every assumption that was not given directly in experience itself. Building that method was the task that defined the next phase of his work, and it began with the most radical move in all of modern philosophy. Part 3. Suspending the World, the Epoché and Phenomenological Reduction. Here is the situation Husserl faced after establishing intentionality as the core structure of consciousness. He had a subject matter, the intentional structures of experience, the ways consciousness directs itself. But he had no reliable way to investigate it. Every time you try to examine your own experience, you bring along a massive cargo of assumptions. You assume the object you perceive exists independently of your perceiving it. You assume that your perception is caused by physical processes, light hitting your retina, signals traveling to your cortex. You assume that the scientific picture of the world is the real one and experience is merely its subjective shadow. These assumptions are not conclusions you arrived at through careful reasoning. They are part of the atmosphere you breathe. Husserl called this package of default assumptions the natural attitude. It is the stance every human being takes in everyday life without ever deciding to take it. A doctor reading a patient's blood work operates in the natural attitude. She takes for granted that blood cells exist, that lab instruments measure real quantities, that disease has physical causes. None of this is wrong. Husserl had no quarrel with the natural attitude as a way of living or as a foundation for science. The problem is that the natural attitude makes it impossible to study experience on its own terms, because it always forces you to look through experience toward the object's experience is supposedly about. Consider what happens when a cognitive scientist studies visual perception. She shows a subject an optical illusion, records their response, and then explains the illusion in terms of neural processing. At every stage, she is treating the experience as a byproduct of something else, something more real, something physical. The experience itself, the actual way the illusion appears to the subject, drops out of the analysis. It becomes merely a clue pointing toward the real story, which is the story of neurons and computations. Husserl did not deny that neurons fire or that computations happen. He denied that this approach could ever tell you what experience is, in its own right, as it is actually lived. To study experience as experience, you have to stop treating it as a symptom of something else. The Epoché is Husserl's method for doing exactly that. The word comes from ancient Greek skepticism and means suspension or abstention. But Husserl is not adopting skepticism. He is using the concept in an entirely different way. In the Epoché, you do not deny that the world exists, and you do not doubt that it exists. You simply set aside the question of existence entirely. You put your natural commitment to an independent external world in brackets, like a mathematician brackets a term in an equation to work on the rest. The commitment is still there. You have not erased it. You have just temporarily refused to let it govern your investigation. What remains after the bracketing is performed? Everything. Your entire field of experience remains exactly as it was. The room still appears around you, the chair still looks solid, the light still falls from the left. Nothing in the texture or content of experience changes when you perform the Epoché. What changes is your attitude toward that experience. You're no longer asking, does this chair really exist? Or is this perception accurate? You're asking, how does this chair appear? What is the structure of this perceptual act? What makes this experience an experience of a chair rather than a table? The questions shift from what is real to how things are given, and that shift opens an entire domain of investigation that the natural attitude had rendered invisible. This is where most people misunderstand Husserl, so the distinction must be precise. The epoché is not idealism, the philosophical position that only minds exist, and the external world is an illusion. An idealist denies the reality of the physical world. Husserl denies nothing. He simply withholds judgment in order to get a clearer view of experience. The epoché is not skepticism either, because the skeptic claims we cannot know whether the world exists. Husserl makes no such claim. He is performing a methodological discipline, not arguing for a philosophical position. And the epoché is not introspection in the casual everyday sense. Introspection is notoriously unreliable because it still operates within the natural attitude, smuggling in assumptions about what the mind is. The epoché is a trained, systematic reorientation of attention toward the structures of experience themselves. It is closer to what a skilled musician does when she stops listening to a chord for its emotional effect and starts hearing the individual intervals and voicings that compose it. After the epoché, Husserl performs what he calls the phenomenological reduction. The word reduction here does not mean shrinking or simplifying, as in reducing a complex problem to a simple one. It comes from the Latin reducere, meaning to lead back. The reduction leads you back from the assumed world of independent objects to the field of pure experience where those objects first appear. In the natural attitude, you live in the world and take it for granted. After the reduction, you live in experience and examine how the world shows up within it. You have not lost the world. You have gained access to the layer of experience that was always mediating your contact with the world, but that you had never examined directly. This idea is already at work in fields you might not associate with philosophy. When a user experience researcher at a technology company tests a new interface, she does something structurally similar to the epoché. She sets aside her own knowledge of how the interface was designed and tries to see it as the user sees it. She brackets the engineering perspective to access the experiential perspective. Her goal is not to determine whether the interface really works in some objective sense. Her goal is to describe how the interface presents itself, how it is navigated, where confusion arises in the act of using it. That is a practical, small-scale version of what Husserl proposed as a universal philosophical method. The difference is that Husserl applied it not to a single product, but to the totality of human experience. But this method, powerful as it is, immediately encounters a challenge. Once you have bracketed the world and turned your attention to experience, what do you find? An enormous, constantly shifting, endlessly varied stream of perceptions, memories, moods, and thoughts. One experience of a red wall differs from every other experience of a red wall. Your perception of this room right now differs from your perception of it 5 seconds ago. If phenomenology is just a catalogue of individual experiences, it has no more rigour than a personal diary. Husserl needed a way to extract universal structures from the flux of experience. He needed to move from this particular perception to the essence of perception as such. That required a second, even more powerful method built on top of the first. Part 4. Seeing Essences. The Eidetic Reduction. The Epoché clears the ground by suspending our assumptions about the independent world. What lies exposed is the field of conscious experience, vast and detailed but seemingly chaotic. If Husserl stopped here, phenomenology would be an exercise in describing one experience after another. A journal of perceptions, feelings and thoughts, each unique, each unrepeatable, each locked to a single moment. That would tell us what experience is like for one person at one time, but nothing about experience as such. Husserl wanted something far more ambitious, to identify the necessary structures that make any experience of a given type possible at all. To understand what he was after, start with a concrete case. You are standing in a gallery, looking at a painting on a white wall. This particular perception has countless specific features. The light is warm and comes from the upper left. The frame is dark wood. Your feet ache from walking. All of these belong to this perception, but none of them belong to perception as such. You could change the lighting, remove the frame, relieve the aching feet, and you would still be perceiving a painting. The question Husserl asks is, what can you not change while still having a perception? What features are so essential that removing them would destroy the act of perceiving entirely? His method for answering this question is called eidetic variation, from the Greek eidos, meaning form or essence. Here is how it works. You take a specific experience, say your perception of the painting, and you begin to alter it in imagination. You change the colour of the painting, then its size, then its position on the wall. You replace the gallery with an open field, then a dark room, then a cluttered attic. You shift from standing to sitting, from seeing with two eyes to seeing with one. At each step, you check whether the result is still a perception. As long as it is, the feature you changed was not essential to perceiving. Now push harder. Can you have a perception without any spatial orientation at all, without the object appearing somewhere in your visual field? No. The moment you strip away all spatial character, you no longer have a perception. You have something else entirely, perhaps a thought or a mood. Can you have a perception without any temporal duration, without the experience occupying some stretch of time? Again, no. A perception that occupies no time at all is not a perception. Through this systematic variation, you discover that spatial orientation and temporal extension are essential to any perception whatsoever. They are not accidental features of this or that particular experience. They are invariant structures without which the very category of perception collapses. These invariant structures are what Husserl calls essences, and the process of extracting them through imaginative variation is called the eidetic reduction. The word reduction here again means leading back, this time from particular instances to their essential form. The eidetic reduction does not discover physical laws or psychological regularities. Physical laws tell you what does happen in fact. Essences tell you what must be the case for something to count as a certain type of experience. A law of physics could, in principle, be revised by future evidence. But the claim that perception requires an object appearing from some perspective is not revisable. It is not an empirical generalization from many observations. It is a structural necessity grasped through insight. This naturally provokes a strong objection. The whole process relies on imagination, on a single person varying examples in their own mind. How could imagination possibly yield necessary truths? You might think that to claim universal knowledge about the structure of perception, you would need to survey every perception ever had by every conscious being. This objection treats essences as if they were empirical generalizations, statistical claims about what most perceptions happen to share. But that misunderstands what the eidetic reduction is doing. When you vary the color of the painting in imagination and notice that perception survives the change, you are not collecting a data point. You are grasping directly that color is not what makes perception perception. The insight is logical, not statistical. It is the same type of insight that lets you grasp that a triangle cannot have 4 sides without needing to examine every triangle in the universe. A second objection cuts deeper. Perhaps what seems essential to perception is actually just a feature of how your particular culture has trained you to perceive. Maybe a person from a radically different culture would vary the examples differently and arrive at different essences. Husserl's response is that the method itself is open to correction precisely because it is repeatable. If someone proposes a counterexample, a genuine case of perception that lacks what you thought was essential, then you revise your eidetic finding. Essences are not proclaimed by authority. They are tested by the community of investigators performing the same variations. This makes eidetic investigation more like mathematical proof than like personal revelation. The individual performs the variation, but any other competent investigator should be able to follow the same steps and reach the same insight. This method is at work in places you would not expect. A trial lawyer preparing cross-examination does something structurally similar to eidetic variation. She takes the witness's story and begins mentally altering its elements one by one. She changes the time of day, the position of the car, the lighting in the room. At each change, she asks, does the story still hold together, or does it fall apart? The point where the story cannot survive a change reveals something essential about its structure. She is not checking facts against the physical world. She is testing the internal coherence of an account. That is eidetic variation applied to narrative rather than perception, but the logical structure is identical. By combining the Epoché and the eidetic reduction, Husserl now has a complete method. The Epoché brackets the world to expose the field of experience. The eidetic reduction extracts the necessary structures of any type of experience from that field. Together, they define phenomenology as a discipline that is neither empirical psychology nor speculative metaphysics. It is the rigorous study of the essential structures of conscious experience, conducted from within experience itself. But having established the method, Husserl immediately turned it on its own subject matter. And the first thing he found was that the internal structure of a single conscious act is far more complex than anyone had suspected. Each act of perception, each judgment, each memory contains within it a polarity, a tension between two aspects that cannot exist without each other. Part 5. The Anatomy of an Act, Noesis and Noema. Apply Husserl's method to the most ordinary experience you can find. You are sitting at a kitchen table, and there is an apple directly in front of you. You see it, that seeing is a single unified event in your conscious life, but Husserl's analysis reveals it has a complex inner structure. There is the activity of seeing, your visual awareness actively directed at the apple from this angle, in this light. And there is the apple as it appears within that activity, the reddish sphere with a slight bruise near the stem. These two aspects are not the same thing, and they are not separable things either. They are two poles of a single act, bound together so tightly that neither can occur without the other. Husserl called the activity pole of the act the Noesis, from the Greek word for the activity of mind. The Noesis is everything the conscious act contributes, the type of directedness, the degree of attention, the mode of engagement. Perceiving is one kind of noesis, remembering is another, judging is a third, imagining is a fourth. Each mode shapes how the object appears, just as the same landscape looks different through a telescope, a camera, and the naked eye. The lens does not create the landscape, but it determines how the landscape presents itself. The noesis is consciousness functioning as a specific kind of lens. The other pole Husserl called the Noema, from the Greek word for what is thought. The Noema is the object as it is given within the act, the apple as perceived, the melody as remembered, the theorem as judged. Here is the critical subtlety that separates Husserl from common sense thinking. The Noema is not the physical apple sitting on the table. The physical apple has a backside, an interior, a chemical composition, a history stretching back to a tree in an orchard. But right now, in this perception, none of that is given to you. What is given is a reddish surface with a particular curvature, seen from this distance, under this light. The Noema is the apple exactly as it shows up in this act of perceiving, no more and no less. Why does this distinction matter? Consider two people sitting across from each other at the same table, both looking at the same apple. One sees the unblemished side, the other sees the bruised side. They are perceiving the same physical object, but their noemata are different. The apple as seen from the left is not the apple as seen from the right. Each noema presents the same object but under different aspects, with different features highlighted and different features hidden. Without the noesis-noema distinction, you would have to say either that they are seeing different objects or that their experiences are identical. Both options are obviously wrong, and Husserl's analysis explains exactly why. The same distinction solves a puzzle about objects that do not exist. A child sitting in bed, gripped by fear, perceives a monster crouching in the shadowy corner of the room. There is no monster. Her fear has no corresponding physical object. But her experience absolutely has a noema, the monster as feared, with its dark shape, its menacing posture, its implied threat. The noesis, fear directed at something in the corner, is entirely real as an act of consciousness. The noema, the fearsome thing as given in that act, is entirely present as a structure within her experience. What does not exist is the corresponding physical object, but that is a question about the world, not about the experience. Husserl's framework lets you describe the full structure of the child's experience without either denying her fear or pretending there is a real monster. Now push the analysis one step further with a case from everyday reasoning. A detective arrives at a crime scene and examines a shattered window from the outside of the building. She sees broken glass scattered outward on the ground, and her Noema includes the window as broken from inside. The same physical window, examined from inside the room, might present a different Noema. Shattered edges pointing inward, suggesting force from outside. She is not just seeing glass, she is seeing the glass as meaning something, as bearing a specific significance within her investigative act. The Noema always carries a sense, a layer of meaning that belongs to how the object presents itself, not to the bare physical thing. Husserl called this meaning layer the sin of the Noema, using the German word for sense. The sin is what makes the perceived object not just a bundle of raw data, but a meaningful thing in a meaningful context. There is a long-standing scholarly dispute about whether the Noema is the object itself viewed phenomenologically or a mediating structure between consciousness and the object. On one reading, advanced by the philosopher Dagfinn Follesdal, the Noema functions like a meaning through which consciousness picks out its object, analogous to how a descriptive phrase picks out the thing it describes. On another reading, advanced by Aaron Gurwitch, the Noema is the object as experienced, not a middleman between you and the thing. This debate has continued for decades and remains unresolved in Husserl scholarship. Both readings find genuine support in different passages of Husserl's writings, and the tension between them reflects a real ambiguity in his work. What is not in dispute is that the Noesis-Noema correlation gives phenomenology a precise vocabulary for dissecting any conscious act from the inside. But this vocabulary immediately reveals a problem that the simple apple example concealed. When you perceive the apple from the front, the back is not given in your Noema. Yet you do not experience the apple as a flat red disc. You experience it as a three-dimensional object with a hidden backside. Your current Noema somehow points beyond itself to what would be given if you walked around the table. It implicitly contains references to other possible Noemata, other possible acts of perception not yet performed. The apple you experience is not confined to what is directly presented in a single glance. It is shot through with references to absent perspectives, to what would be seen, touched, smelled, and tasted. How consciousness manages this, how it builds a complete three-dimensional enduring object out of partial perspectival glimpses, is the next problem Husserl had to solve. Part 6. Horizon and Constitution. How objects are built. Return to the apple on the table, but pay attention to something you normally ignore. Your visual experience right now delivers a coloured surface, roughly spherical, facing you from one side. That is what is actually given. But your experience of the apple includes far more than what is actually given. You implicitly expect that if you reached out and turned the apple, there would be a backside. You expect it to have weight, to feel smooth, to resist being crushed in your hand. You expect that if you bit into it, there would be white flesh and a core with seeds. None of this is seen right now, yet all of it is present in the experience as a system of anticipated possibilities. Husserl's name for this system of anticipated possibilities is the horizon. Every intentional act carries with it a horizon of further experiences that are co-intended but not directly given. The horizon is not a vague haze of expectations floating alongside the perception. It has a definite structure that is shaped by the type of object being perceived. The horizon of an apple includes expectations about its backside, its interior, its texture, its taste. The horizon of a thunderstorm includes expectations about increasing wind, darkening skies, the coming sound of rain on the roof. Each type of object carries its own characteristic horizon, and that horizon is part of what makes the experience an experience of that kind of object. You would not experience something as an apple if your experience did not carry implicit anticipations about how the object would continue to present itself across further encounters. This idea has a direct consequence that challenges common-sense thinking about perception. The standard view assumes that an object is simply there, fully formed, and perception takes a snapshot of it. On this view, the object is finished before you encounter it, and your experience is just a partial record. Husserl reverses this picture entirely without falling into idealism. For Husserl, what counts as the apple is not something given to you complete in a single act. It is something that builds up progressively across a series of acts, each adding new perspectival content, each confirming or revising earlier anticipations. The apple you experience is constituted through the ongoing interplay between what is directly given and what is co-intended in the horizon. Constitution is the name Husserl gives to this process. Walk through the process concretely to see how it works. You see the apple from the front, and your horizon includes the anticipation of a backside. You reach over and turn it. Now the backside is directly given, and it either confirms or disappoints your anticipation. Perhaps there is a large brown spot you did not expect. Your Noema shifts. The apple is now the apple with a bruised back. Your horizon adjusts too. You now anticipate that the interior might be damaged, that it might taste mealy. Each new perception feeds back into the horizon, reshaping the system of expectations that will govern the next perception. The apple, as an experienced object, is this entire dynamic process, not any single snapshot within it. It is always partly given and partly anticipated, always settled in some respects and open in others. Constitution is not construction. Husserl is not saying that consciousness invents the apple out of nothing, the way a novelist invents a character. The apple pushes back. It delivers content that surprises, that contradicts expectations, that forces revisions in the horizon. When you expect a smooth backside and find a bruise instead, the object itself has asserted its independence from your anticipations. Constitution is the process by which consciousness organizes and makes sense of what presents itself, not the process by which consciousness creates from scratch. The world contributes the raw presenting. Consciousness contributes the structure of horizontal anticipation and synthesis. Neither side is dispensable, and neither side can do the job alone. This framework dissolves a debate that has occupied Western philosophy since the 17th century. On one side, realism claims that objects exist entirely independent of consciousness and are just passively received. On the other side, idealism claims that objects are products of the mind and have no existence outside it. Husserl's position is that both views make the same mistake. They treat object and consciousness as two separate, self-sufficient domains that need to be glued together. Constitution shows that object and consciousness are always already intertwined. There is no apple without the horizontal structure of experience through which it presents itself. And there is no horizontal structure floating free without an object that fills, resists, and redirects it. The two are correlative, inseparable aspects of a single reality that Husserl calls the correlation of consciousness and world. You are living inside this structure right now in ways that reach far beyond perception of apples. When you read a novel, each sentence carries a horizon of expectations about where the plot is going. A surprise ending works precisely because it violates a constituted horizon that built up across hundreds of pages. The shock you feel is not random. It is the friction between the co-intended continuation and the actually given one. When a doctor reads a patient's symptoms, each symptom constitutes a horizon of possible diagnoses. The next test result either confirms or revises that horizon, and the patient's condition is constituted across the full series of examinations. At no single point does the doctor have the complete picture. The picture is always partly given and partly anticipated, always in the process of being constituted. But notice what constitution requires. The front of the apple was seen a moment ago. The back is being seen now. For these two perceptions to contribute to the constitution of a single object, they must be connected across time. Consciousness must somehow hold together what has just passed, and what is currently given, and what is about to arrive. If each moment of experience were sealed off from every other, constitution would be impossible. There would be no synthesis, no horizon, no enduring objects, just a disconnected flicker of isolated instants. Husserl realized that the temporal structure of consciousness was not one topic among many. It was the foundation on which everything else in phenomenology rested. And when he examined it closely, he found something that even he did not expect. Part 7. The River That Knows Itself. Time Consciousness. Every act of constitution described in the previous part depends on consciousness holding together what has just passed with what is now present. The back of the apple was seen a moment ago. The front is seen now. Together, they constitute a single, enduring object. But how does consciousness accomplish this binding across time? The standard answer, the one that comes naturally, is memory. You saw the back of the apple, you stored a memory of it, and now you retrieve that memory and combine it with your current perception. Husserl showed that this answer cannot possibly be correct, and the reason why leads into the deepest layer of his philosophy. Take the simplest temporal experience you can find, listening to a melody. A pianist plays 3 notes in sequence, C, then E, then G, forming a rising triad. When the G sounds, the C is no longer vibrating in the air. If each moment of your experience were sealed to its own instant, you would hear only G, a single isolated tone with no melodic character at all. You would never hear a melody, because a melody is not a single sound, but a pattern that stretches across time. Yet you do hear the melody. You hear the G as the completion of a rising figure that began with C. The C is somehow still present in your experience of the G, not as an active sound, but as something that just was and still lingers. The question is what kind of presence this is. The memory explanation says you recall the C when you hear the G. But recalling something is a distinct mental act. It takes you out of the present and directs you back toward the past. When you genuinely remember yesterday's breakfast, you turn your attention away from what is happening now and toward what happened then. That is not what happens when you hear a melody. When the G sounds, you're not performing an act of remembering the C and then somehow stitching that memory onto the current perception. The lingering of the C is not a second act alongside your hearing of the G. It is part of the very same act. Your hearing of the G is, in its own internal structure, shaped by the just having passed of the C. The past note is woven into the texture of the present note as experienced, not added to it from outside. Husserl's name for this is retention. Retention is not memory, and confusing the two collapses the entire analysis. Memory is an active, deliberate turning back towards something that is gone. Retention is the automatic, passive holding on to what has just elapsed, as part of the present moment itself. When the G sounds, the C and E are retained. They are still there in your experience, but in a modified form. They have undergone what Husserl calls a retentional modification, sinking slightly into pastness while remaining part of the living present. Each subsequent moment pushes the earlier moments further into the retentional tail, like a comet trailing a fading luminous wake. The C is more faded than the E, which is more faded than the G, but all three are co-present in the single experience of the melody. Now turn from the past toward the future. When the G sounds, you do not hear it as a dead-end point, but as something pointing forward. If the pianist stops after G, you feel something like mild surprise or incompleteness, an expectation that has been left unfulfilled. You were leaning into the next note before it arrived. Husserl calls this forward-leaning dimension of the present moment pretension. Pretension is not prediction. It is not a conscious guess about what will come next. It is the structural anticipatory character of every present moment, the way each now reaches ahead into the not yet. Just as retention holds the just past within the present, pretension opens the present toward the about to come. The living present, as Husserl describes it, is therefore not a knife-edge instant, but a threefold structure. There is the primal impression, the direct sensory contact with what is happening right now. There is retention, the lingering presence of what has just passed, still held within the current moment. And there is pretension, the anticipatory leaning toward what is about to arrive. These three are not separate events occurring side by side. They are inseparable moments of a single unified experience, like the length, width and depth of a single solid object. Remove any one of them, and the experience of time collapses. Without retention, there is no sense of duration. Without pretension, there is no sense of flow. Without primal impression, there is no sense of nowness. This analysis has a concrete consequence you can verify in your own experience right now. Read the following sentence and pay attention to what happens as your eyes move across it. Each word you read displaces the previous word from direct focus, but the previous word does not vanish from your experience. It lingers as the context that gives the current word its meaning. You cannot understand the word "it" in the middle of a sentence without retaining the subject that it refers to. At the same time, you are always leaning slightly ahead, anticipating the grammatical completion of the phrase. If the sentence ends in an unexpected word, you feel a jolt of surprise that is pretension being defeated. Reading is a continuous enactment of Husserl's threefold temporal structure, performed hundreds of times per minute. But Husserl was not satisfied with describing the structure of temporal experience from the outside. He pushed into a question that threatens to swallow the entire analysis. Consciousness is a flow. We have established that. Each moment sinks into retention as the next moment arrives. But how does the flow itself become aware that it is flowing? You do not merely experience a sequence of tones, you experience yourself as the one hearing the sequence. The flow is not just a series of contents passing through a tube. It is a flow that somehow registers itself as flowing without needing a second, higher-level act to observe it. Husserl argued that the flow of time consciousness has a peculiar double structure. One dimension of its intentionality runs along the sequence of objects. First the C, then the E, then the G. This is horizontal intentionality, directed at the changing content of experience. But there is a second dimension running perpendicular to the first, which Husserl called vertical intentionality. In each moment, consciousness is not only aware of the current tone, it is also implicitly aware of itself as the ongoing act of hearing. Retention does not merely retain the past tone, it retains the past act of hearing the past tone. The flow thus becomes transparent to itself, not through reflection, not through turning around to look at itself, but simply through the retentional structure of each moment. Every present moment carries within it an implicit awareness of the stream of consciousness that produced it. This is what makes time consciousness the deepest layer in Husserl's entire system. Constitution, horizon, noesis and noema, intentionality itself, all of these presuppose a temporal flow that holds itself together. If the flow disintegrated, there would be no constitution of objects, no horizons of anticipation, no identity across perspectives. Time consciousness is not one more topic for phenomenology to investigate. It is the ground on which phenomenological investigation itself stands. Husserl called this ground absolute consciousness, the self-constituting flow that makes all other constitution possible. He struggled with it for decades, returning to it in manuscript after manuscript, never fully satisfied with his formulations. The difficulty is genuine. Describing the flow that underlies all description means using the very capacities whose origin you are trying to explain. Whether this circle is vicious or productive remains one of the most contested questions in phenomenology. But the analysis of time consciousness reveals something else that carries enormous consequences for the rest of Husserl's system. All experience, when traced to its deepest level, points back to a single, continuous, self-aware flow. This flow is not a physical brain process, because physical processes do not have the structure of retention and protension. It is not the empirical self, the person with a name and a biography. because that self is itself constituted within the flow. It is something more fundamental than any particular content, any particular object, any particular self. Husserl called it the Transcendental Ego, and its introduction would become the most divisive move of his career. Part 8. The Transcendental Ego. Every layer of Husserl's analysis has led deeper. From the rejection of psychologism to intentionality, from intentionality to the Epoché, from the Epoché to the structures of Noesis and Noema, from those structures to constitution and horizon, and from constitution to the temporal flow that makes it all possible. At the bottom of this descent, Husserl found something he could not bracket further. There was a consciousness doing all the constituting, a subject at the centre of every intentional act, and that subject could not itself be constituted by something else without starting an infinite regress. This ultimate subject is what Husserl called the Transcendental Ego, and to understand it you must first understand the problem it was meant to solve. Start with a straightforward observation. When you perform the Epoché and bracket the existence of the external world, your own empirical self gets bracketed too. Your body is a physical object in the world. It goes into brackets. Your personality, your biography, your memories of particular events, all of these are facts about a person who exists in the natural world. They get bracketed along with everything else. After the reduction, what remains is not you as a person living in a world, but pure experiencing as such. There is a field of conscious experience unfolding, and that field has a centre, a perspective from which everything appears. That centre is not the biological organism, it is not the psychological self. It is the bare, irreducible subject of all experience. Husserl argued that this bare subject is not empty or featureless. It has a structure. Every intentional act proceeds from it, and the character of those acts reflects back on it. When you perceive something, the act of perceiving issues from the transcendental ego. When you judge, the judging issues from the same source. Over time, habitual patterns accumulate. The ego that has repeatedly judged mathematical propositions develops a habitual disposition toward mathematical objects. The ego that has been repeatedly deceived develops a habitual disposition of suspicion toward testimony. Husserl calls these acquired dispositions the ego's sedimentations, and they give the transcendental ego a personal history without reducing it to an empirical person. This requires careful distinction from two positions it resembles but does not share. René Descartes, 2.5 centuries earlier, had also arrived at a bare subject through a process of doubt. His cogito, I think, therefore I am, established the existence of a thinking thing as the one certainty surviving radical doubt. But Descartes immediately treated this thinking thing as a substance, a mental entity alongside physical entities, and spent the rest of his career trying to explain how these two substances interact. Husserl's transcendental ego is not a substance at all. It is not a thing sitting alongside other things. It is the condition for anything appearing as anything at all. It is not discovered as an object of experience, but revealed as the necessary subject that every experience presupposes. Descartes found a thing that thinks. Husserl found a process of experiencing that constitutes all things, including the empirical self. Immanuel Kant, a century before Husserl, had proposed something closer, the transcendental unity of apperception. This was Kant's term for the fact that all my representations must be accompanied by the possibility of "I think." Every experience must be the experience of some unified subject, or it would not be experience at all. Husserl agreed with the formal point, but objected that Kant never filled it in. Kant's transcendental subject is purely formal, a logical requirement with no describable structure of its own. You cannot say what it is like, how it operates, or how it develops. Husserl claimed that phenomenology could do what Kant could not, actually describe the living, functioning, constituting ego in its concrete activity. The transcendental ego is not an abstract postulate, but an experience that phenomenological reflection can access and investigate. This is where the revolt begins. Husserl introduced the transcendental ego explicitly in his Ideas of 1913, and many of his own students immediately rejected it. The strongest objection came from his most gifted student, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger argued that Husserl's transcendental ego strips away everything that makes human existence what it actually is. We are not pure subjects hovering above the world and constituting it from a detached vantage point. We are beings thrown into a world we did not choose, already involved in practical activities, already shaped by history and culture and mortality. By retreating to a pure ego, Heidegger claimed, Husserl had repeated the very mistake he accused the natural sciences of making. He had abstracted away the concrete, lived reality of human existence in order to reach a pure, idealized structure. Jean-Paul Sartre pressed a different version of the same objection. Sartre argued that when you actually examine consciousness in its living activity, you do not find an ego at the center. Pre-reflective experience, the consciousness you have before you turn around and examine yourself, is egoless. There is seeing but no I doing the seeing. There is hearing but no observer standing behind the hearing. The ego, on Sartre's view, appears only when you reflect on your experience, when you step back and say, "I am the one who saw that." It is a product of reflection, not a condition that precedes experience. If Sartre is right, Husserl's transcendental ego is a philosophical fiction created by the very act of phenomenological reflection that was supposed to discover it. The method generates its own artifact and then mistakes that artifact for a fundamental structure. These objections carry real force, and Husserl never fully neutralized them. His response, developed over decades of unpublished manuscripts, was to insist that the ego is not something added to experience, but something discovered within it. The ego is present in every act as the identical pole from which that act issues, just as the Noema is the identical pole toward which the act is directed. Without the ego pole, there would be no unity of experience, no sense in which this perception and that judgment belong to the same conscious life. Whether this response succeeds depends on whether you accept that unity of experience requires a unifying subject, or whether the unity of the experiential stream is sufficient on its own. The debate remains genuinely open. But the transcendental ego, whether you accept or reject it, leads directly into the deepest challenge Husserl ever faced. If phenomenology traces everything back to a single constituting consciousness, then what about other people? When you see another person, That person appears within your field of experience. They are, in one sense, constituted by your consciousness, just like the apple and the melody. But the other person is not just another object. They are supposed to be another subject, another center of experience, with their own constituting consciousness. If everything in your experience is constituted by your ego, how can another ego, another genuine subject, ever show up within it? This is the problem of intersubjectivity, and it threatened to turn Husserl's entire system into a prison of solipsism. Part 9. The Problem of Other Minds. Intersubjectivity. The problem is precise, and its stakes are total. If phenomenology leads back to the transcendental ego as the ultimate source of all constitution, then everything that appears does so within the domain of that ego. The table is constituted in my experience, the room is constituted in my experience, the apple is constituted in my experience. When another person walks into the room, they too appear within my experience. I see a body, I hear a voice, I notice expressions on a face. All of this belongs to my experiential field, constituted through my horizons and my intentional acts. But the other person is supposed to be precisely what my experience cannot contain. A subject who has their own experience, their own constituting acts, their own transcendental ego. If I constitute the other as an object in my field, I have reduced them to something they are not. And if I cannot constitute them at all, then other people are simply inaccessible to phenomenological description. Husserl took this problem more seriously than any other in his career. He addressed it most fully in his fifth Cartesian meditation, delivered as a lecture in Paris in 1929, and returned to it obsessively in manuscripts spanning decades. His strategy begins with a methodological step he calls the reduction to the sphere of ownness. Before asking how I experience the other person, I first need to identify what belongs to my experience if I strip away everything that depends on other subjects. I bracket all references to other minds, all cultural meanings that presuppose a community, all shared linguistic conventions. What remains is my own body as a living, sensing, moving organism and the physical environment as it appears to me alone. This is my primordial sphere, the layer of experience that would still be there even if I were the only conscious being in the universe. Husserl needs this baseline in order to show precisely how the experience of another subject emerges from it. Within this primordial sphere, my body has a unique status. It is the only object I experience from two sides simultaneously. A surgeon examining a patient's hand sees it from the outside as an anatomical structure. But when you look at your own hand, you experience it simultaneously from outside as a visible shape and from inside as a felt, willed, living limb. You can move it, and when you do, the visual appearance changes in coordination with the felt muscular effort. No other object in your experience has this dual character. A rock has only an outside, a chair has only an outside. Your body has both an outside that you see and an inside that you live. Husserl calls this lived body the Leib, distinguishing it from the mere physical body, or Körper. Now another body enters the room. It walks, gestures, turns its head towards sounds, reaches for objects with apparent purpose. Its bodily movements resemble the movements you know from the inside through your own lived experience of reaching, turning, and grasping. Husserl argues that a transfer of sense occurs not through logical inference, not through argument, but through a passive, pre-reflective process he calls analogical apperception, sometimes rendered as a form of empathy. Your experience of your own body as a living, sensing organism is passively transferred to the other body on the basis of its behavioral resemblance to yours. You do not reason. That body moves like mine. Mine is animated by consciousness. Therefore, that body is probably conscious. The transfer happens beneath the level of explicit thought, as an immediate modification of how the other body is perceived. The other body is given from the start as another lived body, another centre of experiencing, not as a mere physical object, to which you then add a hypothesis about hidden mental states. This is more sophisticated than it first appears, and a concrete scenario shows why. A mother watches her toddler reach for a cup on the edge of a high table, straining on tiptoes, fingers stretching. She does not observe the child's body as a physical system and then reason that it must have a desire for the cup. She sees the reaching itself as meaningful, as an expression of wanting, of effort, of striving. The child's embodied intentionality is directly visible in the movement, not inferred from it. But, and this is Husserl's crucial qualification, the child's inner experience is never directly given to the mother. She cannot feel the child's frustration from the inside. She cannot live the child's perspective. The other's subjectivity is always presented through the other's body, but never as fully present as one's own experience. It is an original kind of givenness, neither direct presence nor mere inference, that Husserl calls appresentation. The other's inner life is co-given alongside their bodily behaviour without ever being directly experienced. But a powerful objection remains and must be confronted at full strength. Even on Husserl's account, the other person is constituted within my experience. My transcendental ego is still the constituting source. The other's subjectivity appears within my field as an appresented sense. How can this truly count as encountering another subject? It seems like the other person's consciousness is still ultimately a meaning constituted by me rather than a genuinely independent centre of experience confronting me on equal terms. Husserl's critics, especially Emmanuel Levinas, argued that this framework cannot escape a fundamental self-centeredness. It makes the other always derivative from the self, always understood by analogy with my own experience rather than encountered as radically other. If intersubjectivity always begins from my primordial sphere and reaches the other only through a transfer of my own self-experience, then the other is never truly other. They are a reflection of myself projected outward. Husserl attempted to answer this by arguing that the constitution of the other changes everything about my own experience. Once the other subject is constituted, the world itself is reconstituted as an objective world, a world that exists for multiple subjects simultaneously. The table I see is now constituted not just as the table for me, but as the table that is also available to you from your perspective. Objectivity on this account is itself an intersubjective achievement. A world that existed only for a single consciousness would not be an objective world at all. It would be a private hallucination. Objectivity requires the interplay of multiple perspectives on the same reality. But whether this appeal to objectivity as an intersubjective achievement fully answers the charge of solipsism remains genuinely disputed. The problem of the other was a wound in Husserl's system that never fully closed. What the problem did accomplish was a decisive shift in Husserl's later thinking. The difficulties of intersubjectivity pushed him to recognize that consciousness never operates in splendid isolation. Before any philosophical reflection, before any scientific theorizing, before any phenomenological reduction, we already find ourselves in a shared world. A world of practical tasks, social roles, familiar objects, and common understanding. This shared pre-theoretical world had always been there, beneath every layer of Husserl's analysis, but he had never given it a name or made it a central theme. In his last years, he did both. Part 10. The Lifeworld. There is an assumption so deeply embedded in modern thought that most people never notice it operating. The assumption is that the world described by physics is the real world, and the world you actually experience is a subjective distortion of it. A sunset, on this view, is not really a blaze of orange and crimson. It is electromagnetic radiation at specific wavelengths striking photoreceptor cells and triggering neural processes that produce the illusion of colour. The warmth of a summer afternoon is not really warmth. It is the mean kinetic energy of air molecules. The sound of a cello is not really rich and mournful. It is compression waves at specific frequencies travelling through a medium. In every case, the world as lived is quietly demoted to mere appearance, while a mathematized world of particles and forces is promoted to the status of reality. Husserl's final major insight was that this demotion is not a discovery of modern science, but a philosophical error hidden inside it. To see the error, you have to reconstruct how it was made. Husserl traced it back to the astronomer and physicist Galileo, who in the 17th century achieved something genuinely revolutionary. Galileo proposed that nature could be described entirely in mathematical terms, that the book of nature is written in the language of geometry. This was not an obvious move. It required stripping away everything about the world that resists mathematical treatment. Colour, taste, smell, warmth, beauty, purpose, these cannot be plugged into equations. So Galileo divided the world into two parts. Primary qualities like shape, size and motion, which are mathematizable, and secondary qualities like colour and warmth, which are relegated to the subjective experience of the observer. Only the mathematizable part was declared real. The rest was declared subjective appearance. This division was the founding act of modern mathematical physics, and its success was staggering. Husserl did not question the success. He questioned what was forgotten in the process of achieving it. When Galileo abstracted mathematical structure from the experienced world, he was performing a specific intellectual operation on a world that was already given to him in experience. The falling stone he described with equations was first a stone he saw, felt, and hefted. The trajectory he modelled in geometry was first a motion he watched with his eyes against a background of sky. The mathematical idealization did not arise from nowhere. It was drawn out of a pre-existing world of lived experience, a world Husserl called the Lifeworld. The life world is the world as we encounter it before any scientific abstraction, the world of colours and sounds and textures, of tools and tasks and other people, of familiar rooms and changing weather. It is the ground on which all theoretical activity, including physics itself, is built. The error Husserl identified is not that Galileo mathematized nature. The error is that the success of mathematization led to the forgetting of the act of mathematization itself. Over centuries, the idealized mathematical world came to be treated as the real world, and the life world from which the idealization was drawn was dismissed as mere subjective appearance. This is exactly backwards. The life world is not derived from physics. Physics is derived from the life world. The mathematical description is an abstraction from lived experience, not a deeper reality that explains lived experience away. When the abstraction forgets its own origin, it begins to distort everything it touches. Science becomes unable to account for the very experiences that gave science its starting point. This is not an abstract philosophical complaint. It has direct consequences you can locate in practice. A neurologist examines a patient who reports that music now sounds flat and joyless after a particular brain injury. The neurologist can identify the damaged region, trace the disrupted neural pathways, and catalogue the deficit in clinical terms. But the patient's actual experience, what it is like for music to lose its emotional depth, does not appear anywhere in the brain scan. The neurological description is drawn from and refers back to the lived experience of hearing music. Yet the methods of neuroscience have no way to capture the experience itself. The life world, the domain where music is joyful or flat, has been systematically excluded from the scientific framework, and the scientist trained to regard only measurable quantities as real has no vocabulary for what has been excluded. The life world is not a private inner theatre. It is radically intersubjective. You and I share a life world in the sense that we navigate the same world of familiar objects, cultural practices, and common understandings without needing to first agree on a theory about what reality is. The baker, the carpenter, the teacher, and the child all inhabit a shared life world long before any of them encounters a physics textbook. Gravity is part of the life world, not as a mathematical law, but as the heaviness of carrying groceries upstairs. Time is part of the life world not as a variable in an equation, but as the rhythm of waking and sleeping, planting and harvesting, waiting and arriving. These are not crude approximations of the scientific concepts. They are the original experiences from which the scientific concepts were abstracted. The abstraction has enormous practical power, but it carries no authority to declare its source unreal. Husserl insisted that the life world has its own structures that can be investigated phenomenologically. It is not a formless chaos that science nobly organizes into order. It has spatial orientation centered on the lived body, temporal rhythm organized by practical concerns, and social articulation structured by shared norms. These structures are not imposed by science, they are presupposed by it. A physicist performing an experiment is already operating within the life world, reading instruments with her eyes, recording data with her hands, communicating results in a shared language, trusting colleagues she recognizes as fellow subjects. Every element of scientific practice rests on a layer of pre-scientific experience that science cannot account for within its own framework. This does not make science false or useless. It makes science incomplete in a way that only the recovery of the life world can repair. This recovery was the task Husserl set for himself in his final years, but the task was not purely academic. Husserl believed that the forgetting of the life world had produced consequences far more dangerous than a mere gap in philosophical theory. The sciences, severed from the world of lived meaning, had become unable to address the questions that mattered most to human beings. Questions about purpose, value, justice, and the meaning of a human life had been declared outside the scope of rigorous knowledge. In an era of technological power and political catastrophe, this was not a harmless omission. Husserl saw it as a crisis, and in his last work he tried to diagnose its full depth and severity. Part 11. The Crisis of the Sciences. Husserl wrote his last major work in the mid-1930s as the Nazi regime was consolidating its power across Germany. He had been stripped of his academic rights because of his Jewish ancestry and was barred from the university where he had taught for decades. The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology was written under these conditions and left unfinished at his death in 1938. This biographical fact matters, not for sentimental reasons, but because the work addresses a specific question. How did European civilization, which defined itself by the pursuit of universal rational knowledge, arrive at a point of barbarism and irrationality? Husserl's answer is not political or sociological, but philosophical. The crisis is rooted in a distortion within the very idea of science itself. The argument of the crisis draws together every thread of Husserl's earlier work into a single diagnosis. The distortion begins with Galileo's mathematization of nature, already described in the previous part. But the crisis traces the consequences further than any of Husserl's earlier writings had done. After Galileo, the success of mathematical physics created an immense prestige for a particular kind of knowledge: quantitative, objective, third-person description. Gradually, this particular kind of knowledge came to be treated as the only real knowledge. Any question that could not be answered by measuring, counting, or calculating was quietly pushed to the margins as subjective, unscientific, or meaningless. Questions about meaning, value, beauty, justice, and the purpose of human life fell into this category. They did not disappear from human experience, but they disappeared from the domain of what counted as serious, legitimate knowledge. Husserl called this process the objectivist narrowing of reason. Reason, which for the ancient Greeks had encompassed ethics, politics, beauty, and the good life, was steadily reduced to a single mode: the calculation of measurable quantities. This was not something that scientists deliberately intended. It was a consequence of the success of the Galilean method, which worked so spectacularly well in physics that it came to be treated as the model for all rational inquiry. Psychology tried to become a physics of the mind, measuring stimulus and response. Economics tried to become a physics of human behavior, modeling agents as rational calculators. Ethics was marginalized as a domain of mere opinion, since moral claims could not be verified by experiment. The result was a civilization with extraordinary technical power and no principled way to decide what that power should be used for. The depth of Husserl's critique becomes clear when you see what he is not saying. He is not saying that science is wrong or that scientific knowledge should be rejected. He is not a romantic yearning for a return to pre-scientific innocence. His argument is that the sciences are in crisis precisely because they have lost contact with their own foundations. The foundations of science lie in the life world, the domain of lived meaningful experience from which all scientific concepts are ultimately drawn. When science forgets this origin, it becomes incapable of understanding itself. It becomes, in Husserl's phrase, a set of techniques divorced from the rational purposes that originally motivated it. The methods still work, the predictions still hold, the technologies still function, but the human meaning of the entire enterprise has been lost. Husserl frames this loss as a betrayal of the original project of European reason. He traces that project back to the ancient Greeks, who first conceived the idea of universal disinterested knowledge pursued for its own sake. Philosophy, in its original Greek sense, was not a specialized academic discipline. It was the commitment to examining all of reality, including human reality, through the exercise of reason. Husserl argues that this commitment carries an inherent direction, a kind of built-in purposiveness he calls teleology. Each stage of Western intellectual history represents an attempt, often stumbling and self-contradictory, to fulfill the original Greek aspiration. The crisis of the modern sciences is not a random accident, but a specific failure within this ongoing project. It is the failure that occurs when reason turns against itself by denying the legitimacy of the very experiences that make reason possible. The prescription Husserl offers follows directly from the diagnosis. If the crisis results from science forgetting the life world, then the cure is a systematic investigation of the life world that reveals the hidden presuppositions underlying all scientific activity. This investigation is, of course, transcendental phenomenology. Husserl believed that phenomenology could re-establish the connection between scientific knowledge and lived meaning by showing how every scientific concept, every mathematical idealization, every theoretical framework is rooted in structures of experience that phenomenology alone can describe. Science would not be abandoned. It would be restored to its proper place as one mode of engagement with a world that is richer and more fundamental than any scientific theory can capture. This diagnosis of crisis has not gone away. When a hospital replaces clinical judgment with algorithmic protocols, optimizing for measurable outcomes while losing the capacity to respond to the specific suffering of a specific patient, the structure Husserl identified is operating. When educational policy measures school quality entirely through standardized test scores, treating everything that cannot be quantified as irrelevant, the same logic is at work. When political discourse reduces complex questions of justice and community to cost-benefit analyses expressed in dollar figures, the objectivist narrowing of reason is in full effect. In each case, a mathematized abstraction has replaced the lived reality it was drawn from and has then been used to govern that reality without acknowledging what was lost in the translation. Husserl's crisis provides a philosophical vocabulary for diagnosing this pattern wherever it appears, and that vocabulary has lost nothing of its power in the century since he forged it. But whether Husserl's proposed cure Transcendental phenomenology itself can deliver what he promised is a question that requires confronting the full weight of the objections his system has accumulated. Every layer of the architecture, from the Epoché to the Transcendental Ego to the theory of intersubjectivity, has been challenged by powerful critics. In the final part, we assess whether the building stands. Part 12. What remains? Tensions, legacy, and the unfinished project. 4 objections strike at the load-bearing pillars of Husserl's system. Each is presented here at full strength because the system deserves opponents of its own caliber. The first objection targets the epoché itself. The claim is that the suspension of the natural attitude is psychologically impossible and philosophically self-defeating. You cannot stop believing in the world. The belief is not a switch you flip, but a background condition of all experience. Even in the act of performing the epoché, you are sitting in a chair, breathing air, reading a page, relying on thousands of worldly commitments. The phenomenologist who claims to have bracketed the world is either deceiving themselves or performing a much more modest operation than they claim. At most, they are directing attention to certain features of experience while ignoring others. That is selective attention, not a radical suspension of the natural attitude. Husserl's response is that the epoché is not a psychological act of disbelief, but a trained redirecting of philosophical attention. You do not stop believing the world exists. You stop letting that belief determine your investigation. A music theorist analyzing a chord progression does not stop hearing the music as beautiful. She merely refrains from letting that aesthetic response dictate her analytical conclusions. The epoché is a disciplined abstention, not a feat of willpower. Whether this response fully answers the objection depends on whether such disciplined abstention can be sustained consistently without smuggling in precisely the commitments it was supposed to suspend. Many phenomenologists after Husserl, including Merleau-Ponty, argued that a fully consistent epoché is impossible because our embodied engagement with the world penetrates every act of consciousness, including the act of attempting the epoché. Merleau-Ponty's conclusion was not that phenomenology is hopeless, but that the reduction can never be completed, only approximated, and that this incompleteness is itself philosophically revealing. The second objection targets the transcendental ego and the charge of solipsism. Heidegger, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty all argued in different ways that grounding phenomenology in a pure ego makes genuine access to the world and to other people impossible. If everything is constituted within the sphere of the transcendental ego, then the independence of the world and the reality of other minds are achievements of my consciousness, not facts I encounter. Husserl insisted that constitution does not mean creation, and that the constituted world genuinely transcends the consciousness that constitutes it. But critics found this reassurance insufficient. If transcendence is itself constituted, they asked, what work is it really doing? The world's independence from me turns out to be a meaning produced by me, which is a strange kind of independence. This objection has never been decisively resolved within Husserl's own framework, and it remains the deepest structural tension in his system. The third objection addresses the relationship between Husserl's early commitment to philosophy as a rigorous science and his late turn to history, culture, and the life world. In his 1911 essay, Philosophy as a Rigorous Science, Husserl explicitly rejected both naturalism and historicism as threats to philosophical rigor. Historicism is the view that all knowledge is relative to its historical context, that there are no truths independent of the culture that produces them. Husserl argued passionately against this view because it would undermine the very possibility of necessary truths that phenomenology claims to discover. Yet the crisis is drenched in historical reflection, tracing the development of European reason from the Greeks through Galileo to the present. Husserl frames phenomenology itself as the teleological culmination of a specific historical tradition. How can a philosophy that claims to discover timeless essences also present itself as the end point of a particular historical development? If phenomenology is historically situated, can it really claim the universal validity Husserl insists upon? Husserl's answer is that history is not the ground of truth, but the medium through which truth is progressively disclosed. The Pythagorean theorem was not created by the Greeks. It was discovered by them within a particular historical context that made the discovery possible. The theorem itself is timelessly true, but the human access to it is historically conditioned. Phenomenology, on this view, is the historical moment at which the structures of consciousness become fully transparent to themselves. This is an elegant response, but it raises a troubling follow-up. If historical conditions can enable the disclosure of truth, can they also systematically distort it? And if so, how would a phenomenologist, working within their own historical conditions, ever detect the distortion? Husserl's faith in the self-correcting power of rational reflection may be justified, but it cannot be guaranteed from within the system it is supposed to secure. The fourth objection comes from a direction Husserl did not live to see fully developed. Modern cognitive science and neuroscience have produced detailed accounts of how perception, memory, and consciousness are shaped by neural processes operating entirely outside awareness. Unconscious computational processes in the visual cortex construct the experience of three-dimensional space from two-dimensional retinal inputs. Emotional responses are triggered by the amygdala before any conscious appraisal occurs. These findings suggest that much of what phenomenology describes as the structure of experience may be the product of subpersonal mechanisms that phenomenological reflection cannot access. If the essential structures Husserl discovers through eidetic variation are actually the output of particular neural architectures, then they are not genuine essences, but contingent features of the human brain, exactly the kind of psychologism Husserl spent his career opposing. This objection is serious, but also frequently overstated. Husserl never denied that consciousness has physical conditions. The Epoché brackets them. It does not deny them. The question is whether the structures of experience can be adequately described in neural terms, and the answer is clearly no. A brain scan showing activation in the visual cortex does not contain the structure of perspective, the distinction between foreground and background, or the horizontal character of perception. These are features of experience that only show up from the first-person perspective and require phenomenological description to be articulated. Neuroscience and phenomenology may be complementary rather than competing, each describing a different level of the same reality. The philosopher Francisco Varela and the neuroscientist Evan Thompson have pursued exactly this kind of integration under the name neurophenomenology, arguing that first-person phenomenological description and third-person neuroscientific data can mutually constrain and enrich each other. Whether this integration fulfills Husserl's vision or quietly abandons it is itself a matter of ongoing debate. After a century of criticism, what in Husserl's work remains genuinely alive? Three things, at minimum, have proven indispensable. First, the insistence that first-person experience is not a secondary phenomenon to be explained away, but the field within which all questions about reality, knowledge and meaning must ultimately be posed. Every scientific theory, every philosophical argument, every political decision is made by a conscious being from within the structures of their experience. No amount of third-person description can replace or eliminate the first-person perspective, because third-person description is itself an activity performed by first-person subjects. This insight has shaped not only continental philosophy, but also philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and the study of consciousness across traditions. Second, the concept of the Lifeworld has proven to be one of the most productive ideas in 20th century thought. It has been taken up by sociologists like Alfred Schutz, by critical theorists like Jürgen Habermas, by philosophers of science questioning the foundations of their disciplines, and by practitioners in fields from medicine to design who recognize that lived experience cannot be reduced to quantitative data. Wherever the dominance of purely technical or quantitative approaches is questioned, the concept of the life world, whether or not Husserl's name is attached, is doing philosophical work. Third, the method itself, the disciplined attention to how things appear rather than rushing to theories about what they are, has proven applicable far beyond philosophy. Qualitative research methods in psychology, sociology and nursing draw directly on phenomenological description. User experience design, as noted earlier, employs a practical version of the Epoché. The entire tradition of existential psychotherapy rests on the phenomenological commitment to understanding the patient's experience as it is lived, not as it is categorized by diagnostic manuals. Husserl would not have recognized all of these applications, but they carry forward the central impulse of his work. Husserl spent his final years writing every day, producing over 40,000 pages of unpublished manuscripts, many of which are still being edited and published nearly a century after his death. He never stopped believing that the work was unfinished, and that the next analysis would bring phenomenology closer to the absolute foundation he sought. He was wrong about the achievability of that foundation, or at least so most of his successors have concluded. But the project of returning again and again to experience itself, of refusing to accept any theory of reality that cannot account for how reality actually presents itself to conscious beings. That project has no expiration date. Every generation that inherits it finds new reasons to take it up and new ways to push it further. That is as close to philosophical immortality as any thinker can get.